The wind howled across the Montana plains like a living thing, clawing at the windows and rattling the loose shingles of Clara Monroe's cabin. Snow whirled in blinding sheets, turning the world outside into a white void. The little oil lamp on the table flickered under each gust that slipped through the cracks in the doorframe, casting shadows that danced across the walls like restless spirits. Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stoked the fire again. The woodpile was running too low for a storm that showed no sign of stopping. She'd planned to ride into town that morning to restock supplies, but the wind had picked up before dawn, forcing her to stay put. Now, as night crept in and the blizzard deepened, she could feel the loneliness pressing heavier than ever. Her small cabin half in, half home hadn't seen a guest in weeks. Most travelers avoided this stretch of prairie during winter, and Clara preferred it that way. She liked the silence, the steady rhythm of chores, and the peace that came from keeping busy. It kept her from remembering. Her late husband, John, had built the cabin with his own hands before the war took him. For years, Clara had kept it running alone, tending to passing riders, cowhands, and the occasional lost soul. But lately, she'd grown weary of strangers, too many men with rough hands and rougher manners. She'd learned to be cautious, to trust no one easily. That was why the sound startled her so badly. The sharp, desperate knock echoing through the storm got Clara froze, her heart leaping. No one would be out in this weather. No one sane, at least. She waited, hoping she'd imagined it. Then came another knock, weaker this time, muffled by the roar of the wind. She took the rifle from above the hearth and approached the door slowly. "Who's there?" she called, raising her voice to be heard over the gale. A man's voice came through, strained and hoarse. "Ma'am, please. Just need shelter for the night." Clara hesitated. Every instinct told her to be careful. But there was something in the tone, a kind of exhaustion that tugged at her heart. She unlatched the door, opening it just enough to peer out. The figure standing there was half buried in snow. His hat was pulled low, his coat crusted white, his gloved hands trembling. Beneath the layers, she could make out the lean frame of a cowboy, a man used to hard rides and harder weather, but right now, he looked near frozen to death. "Lord have mercy," she murmured, stepping back. "Get in before the wind takes you with it." He stumbled inside, bringing a gust of icy air with him. For a moment, neither spoke. Clara shut the door fast and turned to look him over. He was tall, probably in his 30s, with a rugged face half hidden behind a short beard. His eyes and unguarded gray-blue met hers with gratitude and a hint of embarrassment. "Much obliged." "Ma'am," he said quietly, removing his hat. "Didn't mean to scare you none." Clara nodded, still gripping her rifle. "You're lucky you didn't freeze out there. Sit by the fire." He obeyed without argument, sinking to his knees before the flames. She could see him shiver as the heat began to thaw the frost from his coat. Steam rose from his shoulders. "What's your name?" she asked after a pause. "Eli," he replied, his voice steadier now. "Eli Carter. Been ridden since sunup, got caught in the storm halfway from Bear Creek." Clara set the rifle down but didn't quite relax. "Well, Eli Carter, you'll have to make do with what I got. There's stew on the stove and a bit of coffee left, if you don't mind it weak." He smiled faintly, and for the first time that night, something warm flickered in the room that had nothing to do with the fire. Outside, the wind raged on, but inside Clara's cabin, two strangers sat in uneasy silence, each with their own ghosts. Neither knowing the storm had just brought them more than shelter. It had brought the beginning of something neither expected to find again. Hoped out the warmth of the fire slowly pushed back the chill that had clung to Eli's bones. But the air between him and Clara remained crisp with unease. The storm still roared outside, rattling the windows like an impatient visitor who refused to leave, yet inside the cabin, The silence was louder than the wind. Clara moved about with the quiet precision of someone used to solitude. Her every motion was purposeful, stirring the pot of stew, ladling broth into a chipped bowl, refilling the kettle with snow to melt for water. She didn't speak unless she had to, and Eli, perhaps out of respect or simple exhaustion, didn't push her to. He sat close to the hearth, holding his hands out to the fire. His gloves lay drying nearby, the leather cracked from wear. He had the look of a man who'd spent years on the trail sun-darkened skin, lines etched deep around his eyes. A steady kind of stillness that spoke of both patience and pain. When Clara finally handed him the bowl, she did it cautiously, her fingers brushing his just long enough for him to notice the calluses on her hands. Strong, capable, but undeniably feminine. "Thank you." "Ma'am," Eli said softly, his voice carrying the slow drawl of the frontier. "Didn't mean to intrude on your peace." Clara folded her arms. "Peace is in short supply out here. You'll find warmth, but not much else." He gave a small, understanding nod and began to eat. The stew was simple beans, potatoes, a bit of salt pork, but to him it tasted better than any fine meal. He ate slowly, mindful of her watchful eyes. Clara leaned against the table, studying him. She wasn't sure what to make of this man. There was no arrogance in him, no drunken swagger or sly grin like the ranch hands who sometimes passed through. He spoke little, moved carefully, and seemed more burdened than dangerous. Still, she'd learned not to let appearances fool her. "You said you're comin' from Bear Creek?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Yes, ma'am." Was headed south toward the Gallatin Valley. "Thought I could outrun the weather." "You thought wrong." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Seems so." She almost smiled back but caught herself. "You got family waiting on you there?" He shook his head, setting the empty bowl aside. "No, ma'am. Just work, maybe." That answer made her pause. Maybe. There was something behind that word, something uncertain, unfinished. But she didn't pry. If life on the prairie had taught her anything, it was that everyone carried something they didn't want to speak of. The storm showed no sign of easing. By the time Clara glanced out the window, snow had buried the porch steps and piled high against the fence. She sighed, tugging her shawl tighter. "You'll be staying the night, then?" "No one's going anywhere till morning." Eli nodded, though he seemed hesitant. "I can bed down by the fire." "Don't need much." Clara hesitated. The cabin was small, one main room, a little kitchen, and the corner where her bed sat curtained off for privacy. Having a strange man under her roof overnight went against every rule she'd lived by since her husband's death. But leaving him out there was out of the question. She wasn't heartless. "You'll take the floor," she said firmly. "Blankets are in that chest. Don't go wandering." Eli rose, dipping his head politely. "Wouldn't dream of it, ma'am." Something in his tone, gentle, respectful, and edged with quiet humor, made her pulse quicken before she caught herself. She turned back to the fire, pretending not to notice the small smile that ghosted across his face. As night deepened, she listened to his even breathing as he settled by the hearth. The wind shrieked against the roof, but inside, the sound of another human presence, steady, warm, alive, brought an unexpected comfort she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, Clara didn't feel completely alone. She told herself it was just for one night, just until morning. But deep down, a small voice whispered that the storm outside wasn't the only one she'd have to weather. By the time the clock on the mantel struck 9, the storm had turned savage. The wind screamed like something alive, clawing at the chimney, shaking the shutters, and forcing its icy breath through every crack in the cabin walls. The fire hissed and flared under the assault, but Clara kept feeding it logs. Determined to hold back the cold. Eli had spent the last few hours quietly mending one of her broken chair legs, unasked. just something to keep his hands busy. Clara noticed the care he took, the patience in each stroke of his knife as he shaped a new dowel. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his voice carried an easy warmth that soothed even her wary heart. She wanted to tell herself that she was just being polite, that the flicker of interest she felt was nothing more than gratitude. Yet every time their eyes met across the small cabin, something unspoken lingered there, a pull she hadn't felt since long before she'd been widowed. When she rose to check the stew pot for morning breakfast, Eli stood too. "You ought to rest," he said. "You've been on your feet all day." Clara arched an eyebrow. "And you think I'm going to let a stranger finish my chores?" He smiled, the firelight catching the faint dimple in his cheek. "No, ma'am. Just thinking you've done more than your share." That smile, steady, quiet, and entirely sure of itself, disarmed her. She busied her hands just to keep from looking at him. "You'll find the blankets in the chest," she said briskly. "Floor by the fire's yours for the night." Eli nodded, retrieving the bedding. He unrolled one of the quilts, spread it near the hearth, and settled his saddlebag beside him. But when he laid down, Clara noticed the draft coming from under the door, whistling across the floorboards straight toward him. The temperature was dropping fast. Even the fire couldn't fight the cold forever. "You'll freeze down there," she muttered. "I've had worse," he replied. Though his voice carried a shiver he tried to hide, Clara hesitated, then sighed, muttering under her breath, "Lord, forgive me." She drew back the curtain that divided her sleeping space from the rest of the cabin. Her bed, a modest thing of pine and wool, wasn't much larger than a cot, but it was warm, layered thick with quilts. "There's only one bed," she said, her tone practical but her heart beat anything but. Eli looked up, unsure if he'd heard her right. "Beg pardon?" She folded her arms. "If you catch your death down there, I'll have to drag you to town myself, and I'm not doing that in 3 feet of snow. You can share, if you keep to your side." For a moment, he didn't move. Then that slow, knowing smile curved his mouth again, the one that made her knees feel unsteady. "Then I'll hold you till morning," he said gently, voice low enough to make the words hum in her chest. Her cheeks flamed. "That's not what I meant." He chuckled softly. "Didn't say I would. Just said I'd hold you if you needed it." Clara huffed, pulling back the quilt. "Well, I won't." Eli removed his boots quietly, setting them near the fire. When he lay beside her, the bed dipped slightly, his warmth radiating even through the layers between them. She faced the wall, willing herself to sleep, but her heart thudded like a hammer. Minutes stretched into hours. The wind outside roared and whined, but inside the small cabin, another storm brewed, quieter, deeper. Far more dangerous. At one point, she shifted under the blanket, and his arm brushed hers, just a whisper of contact, but enough to send a shiver down her spine. Neither spoke. Neither moved away. When she finally drifted into sleep, Clara dreamed of open fields in spring and the feeling of being held not by duty or fear, but by something gentle and alive. And though Eli never once crossed the invisible line between them, his steady presence through the long night made her realize something she hadn't dared in years. She didn't mind the company of a good man. The morning came slow and gray, dragging its pale light across the frost-bitten windows. The storm had quieted some time before dawn, but the cabin still felt steeped in that hush that follows a long night when even the fire's embers seem reluctant to move. Clara stirred first. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was, only that something heavy and warm rested against her shoulder. Then it came rushing back. The cowboy, the storm, the single bed. Her breath caught. Eli lay beside her, still asleep. His arm had slipped across her waist sometime during the night, his hand resting lightly against her hip as though it had found its place there without thought. His face, softened by sleep, looked almost boyish in the weak light, peaceful, unguarded. It startled her how gentle he looked. She froze, not daring to move. For all her stubbornness the night before, part of her had felt safer than she had in years. Not because he touched her, no, it was deeper than that. It was because, for the first time since her husband's death, she'd felt the presence of another heartbeat close enough to remind her she wasn't entirely alone. Still, propriety and pride kicked in quickly. She slipped free of his arm and rose quietly, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. "Lord have mercy," she muttered under her breath, half embarrassed, half exasperated at herself. Eli stirred at the sound. "Mornin', ma'am," he said softly, his voice still rough with sleep. Clara turned to find him sitting up, rubbing the back of his neck. "You snore," she said, trying to keep her tone brisk. He grinned, slow and lazy. "You weren't sleeping much to know that." Her cheeks flamed. "Don't flatter yourself, cowboy." He laughed, then a deep, rich sound that filled the small cabin and did strange things to her heart. To cover her fluster, she busied herself with the kettle, pouring water over coffee grounds. The smell filled the room, mingling with the scent of wood smoke and melting snow. Eli took the hint and rose, pulling on his boots. He moved with an ease that came from long years on the trail, but she noticed the slight limp when he walked toward the door. "You hurt?" she asked before she could stop herself. "Old break," he said, flexing his knee. "Storm like that just reminds me it's there." Clara frowned. "You should have said something." "I'd have," she caught herself. "Never mind." He tilted his head. "You'd have what?" "Fussed over me like a nurse?" "I was going to say offered you an extra blanket," she said primly. His smile said he didn't believe her, but he didn't push. Instead, he helped himself to the small window latch and peered outside. "Snow's up to your fence line," he murmured. "You won't be going to town for a while." She sighed. "Figures." Eli turned back toward her, his expression thoughtful. "If you'll let me, I can help dig you out. Maybe cut more wood, too. Looks like your pile's run low." She blinked. No one had offered her help in a long, long time. "I can manage." "I don't doubt that," he said, his voice calm. "But it's easier with two sets of hands." That simple offer, so unassuming, so kind, made her chest tighten. She wanted to tell him no, to keep that safe distance between them. But the truth was, she didn't want him to leave just yet. After breakfast, they worked together in companionable silence, clearing snow from the porch and chopping wood. He worked steady and sure, his movements precise, each swing of the axe clean and measured. Clara watched him when she thought he wasn't looking, the strength in his arms, the quiet focus in his eyes. There was a steadiness to him, the kind that didn't ask for anything but offered everything. As the day waned, they stood together by the fire again, warming their hands. Outside, the storm's fury had passed, leaving a world glistening and still. Clara glanced at him from the corner of her eye. "You're a good worker," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "You're a good woman." Her heart stuttered. She looked away, pretending to fuss with the fire. "Don't say things like that." "Why not?" He asked quietly. "Because I might start believing you," she whispered. For the first time, neither of them looked away. And though the room was small, it suddenly felt like the whole wide world had narrowed to that single, fragile moment between them, warm, uncertain, and alive. By dawn the next day, the storm had quieted to a whisper. The sky over the Montana plains was soft and pale, streaked with the faintest gold where the sun struggled to rise through the mist. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting a sleepy warmth over everything: the iron stove, the rough-hewn table, the pair of boots drying near the door. Clara woke to the faint sound of movement. For a moment, she thought it was the wind again. But then she heard the careful creak of floorboards, the quiet scrape of a chair. She rose, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, and peeked past the curtain. Eli was already up, his broad shoulders framed in the weak morning light. He was crouched near the door, repairing the broken hinge with a small pocket knife and a few makeshift nails he must have scavenged from his saddlebag. His hair was still damp from melting snow, curling slightly at the edges. Clara watched him in silence for a moment. There was something peaceful about the way he worked, steady, precise, and without complaint. It wasn't often a man fixed what he broke without being asked. "You don't need to do that," she said finally, her voice softer than she intended. Eli looked up with a small smile. "Figured I owed you at least a good door after near freezing it off last night." She tried not to smile back, but failed. Most men would have just said thank you and gone on their way. He shrugged, wiping his hands on his trousers. Most men don't get treated kindly by a stranger. That word kindly landed heavier than she expected. It had been a long time since anyone had used it about her. She moved to the stove, busying herself with coffee grounds and biscuits left over from yesterday. "You'll want a hot meal before you ride out," she said. Eli stood, stretching slightly. "Ride out, huh?" He glanced toward the window where the snow still lay thick. "Might take me a spell to get through that. Besides—" He paused, meeting her eyes. "Reckon I wouldn't mind helping you restock that woodpile first." Clara hesitated. "You planning on staying, Mr. Carter?" "Only till you say otherwise." She wasn't used to a man asking permission to stay. Most took what they wanted and left her to clean up the mess. Eli, though, seemed to move with quiet respect, always asking, never assuming. It unnerved her, this gentleness. When he sat down to eat, she joined him. The table between them was small. Their knees brushed once, and both pretended not to notice. "So," she began carefully, "a man ridden alone through a blizzard, what's he running from?" Eli froze for half a second before taking another sip of coffee. "You don't waste time with small talk, do you?" "I don't see the use," she said simply. He studied her a moment, then sighed. "Truth is, I ain't running." "Not exactly. But there's a ranch foreman back near Bear Creek who'd like folks to think I stole from him. Got ugly when I called him out on beating his hands. Next thing I knew, the sheriff had a warrant with my name on it." Clara's brow furrowed. "So you're a wanted man." "Not the kind you should worry about," he said evenly. "Didn't take a thing that wasn't mine. But out here, the man with more cattle usually gets believed." She didn't answer at first. Her late husband had worn a badge. She'd seen good men accused of bad things and worse men walk free. "You plan to clear your name?" Eli nodded. "Soon as I figure how. But I needed to get clear of the posse first." There was no fear in his tone, only quiet weariness. Clara believed him. She wasn't sure why, but she did. "You can stay here a few days," she said at last. "Long enough to let that storm pass, and maybe long enough to think on what comes next." He looked up, meeting her gaze, something unreadable flickering there. "I appreciate that, ma'am, truly." Clara's lips curved faintly. "And stop calling me ma'am. Makes me feel ancient." He grinned, a slow, genuine thing that warmed the room. "All right, then. Clara." Hearing her name and his voice felt like sunlight after a long winter strange. Bright, and far too easy to want more of. 3 days passed, and the storm's fury faded into a hush that blanketed the world in white. The air outside was so still that even sound seemed to vanish. No crows calling. No wind through the pines, only the groan of snow-laden branches shifting in the cold. Inside the cabin, life had found a rhythm again. Clara chopped vegetables while Eli split wood, their days stitched together by small, easy silences and glances that lasted just a little too long. He'd repaired her fence, patched the leaking roof, and even whittled her a new spoon after she broke the old one stirring stew. But beneath the quiet peace, Clara felt something stirring, a fragile comfort she wasn't sure she should trust. Every time she caught Eli's gaze, there was something there. Respect, yes, but also a kind of longing that mirrored her own. And yet, every evening when he'd sit near the hearth, eyes distant, staring into the fire as though it might reveal his past, she was reminded that his story wasn't finished. That reminder came pounding at her door one gray morning. The knock was sharp, heavy, and far too familiar, the kind of knock that came from men used to carrying authority. Clara stiffened instantly. Eli was outside, hauling firewood. She dried her hands on her apron and went to the door, peering through the frosted window pane. 3 riders waited outside, horses steaming in the cold. Their coats were dusted with snow, and the glint of badges caught the faint light. The man in front, a broad-shouldered sheriff with a jaw set like stone, lifted a hand. "Mrs. Monroe," he called, his voice muffled by the wind. "We need a word." Her stomach tightened. She opened the door halfway. "Sheriff Mason, what brings you out here?" "Looking for a man," the sheriff said, stepping closer. "Name of Eli Carter. Wanted out of Bear Creek for theft and assault." Clara's blood ran cold. She forced herself to keep her expression calm. "You think he's out here?" "Riders said they saw tracks heading this way before the storm hit. Figured he might have taken shelter." She glanced toward the barn, praying Eli had heard the voices and stayed hidden. "I haven't seen anyone but snow and misery these past few days," she said carefully. The sheriff studied her, eyes narrowing. He was a shrewd man, one who'd likely known her late husband. "Mind if we take a look around?" She swallowed hard, forcing a steady tone. "You can check the barn, but I don't allow strangers tramping through my home." Mason hesitated, then nodded to his deputies. "Barn first." As they trudged away, Clara shut the door and pressed her back against it, her pulse hammering. Moments later, she heard a faint creak from the floorboards near the pantry. She turned, and there he was. Eli stood half in shadow, his hat low, face drawn tight. "You heard," she whispered. He nodded once. "Didn't want to drag you into this." "They're searching the barn," she said quickly. "If they come back," he cut her off, his voice calm but tense. "I'll go out the back, take the woods. Won't bring them to your door again." Clara stepped closer, gripping his arm. "No, you'll freeze or get yourself killed. There's a cellar beneath the trapdoor in the pantry. Go." For a heartbeat, he hesitated, eyes searching hers. "Why help me?" "Because I believe you," she said simply. "And because I've seen enough men falsely accused to know the law don't always serve justice." Eli's expression softened. "You're something else, Clara Monroe." "Go," she urged, pushing him toward the trapdoor. He disappeared just as boots crunched on the porch again. Clara slammed the door shut, grabbed a broom, and pretended to sweep as the sheriff entered. "Nothing in the barn," Mason said, eyes scanning the room. "Mind if I—" She cut him off, chin high. "You already got your look, Sheriff. Ain't no outlaw here." Their gazes locked, a silent challenge hanging between them. Finally, Mason tipped his hat. "All right, ma'am. But if you see him, you best tell me. Man like that can bring trouble." When they rode off, Clara waited until the last echo of hooves faded before lifting the trapdoor. Eli climbed out, dusted with cobwebs but alive. "You didn't have to lie for me," he said quietly. Clara met his gaze, steady and unafraid. "Maybe not. But I wasn't about to let them take an innocent man." Outside, the snow fell softly once more. Inside, the air between them felt charged, no longer just with fear, but with something deeper, riskier, and far more dangerous than the storm itself. By the time dusk settled over the plains, the world outside the cabin had gone still again. The snow gleamed blue beneath the fading light, and the air held that sharp, brittle quiet that follows tension. Inside, Clara moved through her kitchen in silence, her hand steady but her heart far from it. Eli sat near the fire, his face half in shadow. Since the sheriff's visit that morning, neither of them had spoken much. Every so often, he'd glance toward the window as though expecting riders to appear at any moment. Clara could feel his restlessness, the guilt twisting through him like a splinter he couldn't dislodge. When she finally brought him a mug of coffee, he looked up with that same gentle gratitude that always disarmed her. "You didn't have to do what you did," he said softly. "I know," she replied, setting the cup down beside him. "But I did it anyway." He studied her, his eyes flickering with something unspoken. "Why risk lying to the law for me? You don't even know me." Clara crossed her arms, the firelight catching the auburn in her hair. "I know enough. You didn't look me in the eye like a liar does. You didn't take what wasn't yours, and you've worked harder these last 3 days than most men in a month." A wry smile touched his lips. "That your way of saying you trust me?" "It's my way of saying I don't believe you're the villain they think you are," she answered. For a long moment, the only sound was the pop of the fire. The flames danced across his features, and Clara realized he looked younger tonight, or maybe just tired of wearing the weight of suspicion. He leaned back in the chair, running a hand through his hair. "You deserve to hear it straight," he began quietly. "There was trouble back at the Bardee Ranch. Foreman named Holt. Mean sort. Treated the men like animals. One night he near beat a stable hand half to death. I stepped in, took his whip from him, ended up breaking his jaw in the scuffle. Next day, he told the sheriff I'd stolen a horse and his payroll money. Whole thing was a lie, but Holt's word was gold in that town." Clara listened without interrupting, her hand slowly tightening around her shawl. "So you ran," she said finally. "Didn't see much choice," Eli replied. "Couldn't fight a man's money and influence from behind bars." She looked into the fire, thinking of her late husband, the lawman who'd believed in justice but died chasing it. "John used to say the law was like a fence," she murmured. "Good when it keeps the wolves out, but sometimes it traps the wrong things inside." Eli's gaze softened. "Your husband?" She nodded, the ache of the name still sharp even after years. "He died chasing a murderer up in the hills. Never made it back. Since then, I've learned fences don't always protect." For a while, neither spoke. The room seemed to hold its breath, warmed only by the flicker of the fire. Eli's voice broke the silence, low and earnest. "I'm sorry, Clara, for what you lost, and for bringing more danger to your door." "You didn't bring danger," she said. "You brought truth. That's rarer these days." Their eyes met then, steady, searching. Clara saw the honesty in him, the bruised decency of a man trying to do right in a world that had turned wrong. And he saw in her not just kindness, but courage, the kind that comes from surviving heartbreak and still choosing to care. When the clock ticked past 9, she moved to stand beside him, the firelight painting gold across her skin. "You'll stay here till it's safe to ride out," she said softly. He looked up at her, voice barely above a whisper. "And if I don't want to ride out?" Her breath caught. "Then you'll have to tell me what it is you do want." "Eli Carter." The air between them grew still, the space small and pulsing with something that felt like the beginning of a promise or the edge of a fall. Eli reached out slowly, his hand brushing hers just once, light as breath. "I want a chance," he said, "at something honest. For once." Clara didn't pull away. The fire cracked, a soft wind sighed through the window, and for the first time in years, she let herself hope that maybe warmth wasn't something to fear. The next morning dawned soft and pale, the kind of winter light that made even the snow seem shy to sparkle. Clara stood by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. She watched Eli saddle his horse out by the barn. every movement deliberate, tightening the straps, brushing the snow from the worn leather, checking the bit. He'd said little at breakfast, only that the roads were clearing and it was time for him to move on. She'd nodded, pretending to agree, pretending it didn't matter. But her chest felt heavy, her heart uncertain. For days, the cabin had been alive again, filled with the sound of two voices, two lives brushing close. Now the quiet that once comforted her felt unbearable. Eli stepped inside, his hat in his hand. "Snow's packed enough I can ride south before nightfall." Clara turned from the window, forcing a small smile. "Then you'd best get going. Don't want the sheriff finding your trail." "Don't reckon I do," he said, his tone light but his eyes unreadable. "You've done more for me than I deserve." She shook her head. "I just gave you a roof and a bit of stew." "You gave me more than that," he said quietly. Something in his voice, low, almost reverent, made her pulse quicken. She busied herself with gathering the dishes, anything to keep her hands from trembling. "You'll find honest work down south, I'm sure of it." "Maybe," he said, stepping closer. "But it won't be this." She turned then, frowning slightly. "This? This quiet? This kindness? This cabin that feels more like home than any place I've ever been?" Her breath caught. "Don't say things like that." "Why not?" "Because it's foolish." Her voice wavered. "You'll be gone by sundown, and I'll be here, alone, same as before." He hesitated, studying her like a man memorizing the last light before dark. "You ever get tired of being alone, Clara?" She wanted to say no, to lie the way she always had. But the truth pressed at her throat, hot and fierce. Every day. The silence that followed was fragile, charged. Outside, a crow cried once across the endless snowfields. Inside, the air seemed to hum. Eli took another step toward her, close enough that she could see the faint scar along his jaw, the soft rise of breath beneath his shirt. His voice came low, almost a whisper. "Then maybe we don't have to be." Her heart thudded. "Eli?" He lifted a hand, calloused fingers brushing a stray curl from her cheek. She should have pulled back, should have stopped him before her defenses crumbled. But she didn't. For so long she'd lived behind walls built of grief and habit, convinced love was something she'd used up long ago. And yet here he was, a man with no promises, no riches, only a quiet steadiness that felt truer than anything she'd known. When his thumb traced her jaw, she felt the world narrow to that single touch. The space between them vanished, and before she could think, his mouth found hers. It wasn't a desperate kiss. It was slow, cautious, like a question asked in the dark and answered in a sigh. His hand slipped to the back of her neck, his warmth seeping through every inch of her. For the first time in years, Clara didn't think. Didn't plan, she just felt. When they finally broke apart, she was trembling, not from fear, but from the startling realization that she didn't want him to leave. Eli rested his forehead against hers, breathing her in. "Tell me to go," he murmured. She couldn't. "I should," she whispered. "But I can't." His lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Then don't." The clock on the mantel ticked softly. Outside, snow began to fall again, light, gentle, forgiving. Clara lifted her eyes to his, and for once, she didn't hold anything back. "If you stay," she said quietly, "you'd better mean it." Eli brushed his thumb over her lips, tender as a vow. "Darlin', I don't do things halfway." And just like that, the distance between them, the grief, the fear, the long, empty years melted away. One kiss had undone it all. By the fire, with the storm whispering outside and morning light soft against the windows, two hearts found the courage to hope again. The snow melted slowly that spring, retreating in patches from the meadows and leaving behind glistening rivulets that whispered through the grass. Clara's cabin stood quiet again, smoke curling softly from its chimney. Weeks had passed since Eli rode away, and though the world outside began to thaw, her heart hadn't quite learned how. Each morning she told herself she'd forget him, that she'd stop glancing at the road beyond the barn, stop setting an extra place at the table, stop listening for hoofbeats when the wind rose at night. But some absences have await all their own silent, steady. Impossible to ignore. Eli had left her with only a few words and a promise. I'll come back when I've cleared my name. At first, Clara hadn't believed it. Men made promises in moments of warmth, she knew, and the world outside had a way of changing them. Yet some small, stubborn part of her, perhaps the same part that had taken him in that first, stormy night, held faith. She poured herself into work to keep from thinking. Fixing the fence, mending old linens, taking in travelers passing through on their way to Helena. But even they noticed something different about the widow who ran the cabin by the creek. Her eyes lingered on the horizon now, softer, less guarded. She smiled more easily but carried a faraway look, as if her heart wandered somewhere her body could not follow. Then, one cool morning in late April, a rider came through town with news from down south. Clara was hauling water when she heard the two merchants talking by the well. Said the truth came out clear as daylight, one of them said. That ranch foreman Holt, I think, got himself caught stealing the payroll he blamed on another man. Yeah, the other replied. Cowboy named Eli Carter. Fought to clear his name, brought the real thieves to justice. Sheriff said he's ridden north now, helping set things right for the men who lost work. Clara froze, her hands tightening on the bucket handle. For a heartbeat, she thought she'd imagined it. But as the words sank in, her chest filled with something she hadn't let herself feel in months. Hope. That evening, the sun dipped low over the hills, painting the snowcaps gold. She sat by the window, her mending forgotten on her lap. The clock ticked softly. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and thawed earth. And then she heard it. A steady, rhythmic sound in the distance, hoofbeats. She rose slowly. Her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and prayer. Through the fading light, a figure emerged along the trail. A rider, broad-shouldered, hat pulled low, horse dark as river stone. Eli. He dismounted near the porch, dust swirling around his boots. When he looked up, his eyes met hers through the window. He smiled, the same quiet, knowing smile that had once undone her completely. Clara stepped outside, her shawl tugged by the breeze. For a long moment, neither spoke. The world around them seemed to still, the only sound the soft creak of saddle leather and the rush of the creek nearby. You came back, she finally said, voice trembling. Promised I would, he replied. Cleared my name. Sheriff even offered me work back at the Bar D, but I told him I already knew where I belonged. Her throat tightened. And where's that? He took a step closer, eyes warm as sunlight after snow. Right here, if you'll have me. For the first time in years, Clara didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, closing the distance, her hand finding his. I waited, she whispered. I know, he said, squeezing her fingers gently. And I came home. The wind sighed through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and rain. In that quiet moment, as the last of winter slipped away, Clara realized that love, real love, wasn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. It was about faith. The kind that holds on through storms, silence, and distance. And as Eli drew her into his arms, the world finally felt right again. That night, the wind carried the soft scent of rain across the plains. The moon hung low over the horizon, silvering the edges of the clouds and glinting on the wet grass. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled with the steady hum of home, its warmth chasing away the chill that had once lived in every corner. Clara sat near the hearth, her hands folded in her lap, the light painting her features gold. She still half expected to wake up and find it all a dream. Eli's return, his voice filling her quiet rooms again, his laughter echoing off the wooden walls. But he was there, real and solid, sitting across from her with his hat resting on his knee. For a while, neither spoke. It wasn't the silence of strangers this time. It was the kind that comes after understanding, when words feel too small for what's in the heart. Finally, Eli looked up, his eyes catching the flicker of the fire. "You kept the place just like it was," he said softly. "Feels like I never left." Clara smiled faintly. "Didn't change much. Thought if I did, you might not find your way back." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching her the way a man studies something precious. "I almost didn't," he admitted. "After I cleared my name, they offered me land down south. A chance to start over. But I couldn't stop thinking about this place, the smell of pine in the morning, the sound of your voice when you said my name. I reckon no patch of earth could feel like home without you in it." Her breath caught. For years she had lived in solitude, believing the world had taken all it could from her. Yet here was this man, scarred, imperfect, but steady, offering her not rescue, but something deeper. "A life shared. Eli," she murmured, voice trembling. "You don't owe me anything." He shook his head. "Don't talk like that. I don't stay because I owe you. I stay because I want to." The fire popped softly, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside, rain began to fall in gentle sheets, pattering against the roof. The sound filled the quiet between them, wrapping around their words like a lullaby. Eli rose slowly and crossed the room to stand before her. He held out a small parcel wrapped in cloth. "Got something for you," he said. She blinked, unwrapping it carefully. Inside lay a silver locket, worn smooth by time. Inside, on one side, was a small photograph of her drawn from memory, sketched in pencil. On the other, a single wildflower, pressed and dried. Clara's throat tightened. "You kept this?" "Carried it with me every mile," he said quietly. "When things got rough, I'd look at it. Reminded me why I was fighting to make it back." Tears welled in her eyes, soft and shimmering. "You fool, man," she whispered, smiling through them. "You never even knew if I'd be here." "I knew," he said simply. "Some things you just—" "No." She stood, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for him. His fingers met hers, strong and sure, and when he drew her close, all the months of waiting and wondering melted away. He tilted her chin up gently. "Told you once I'd hold you till morning," he said, a slow grin spreading across his face. Her lips curved with memory. "That was a long time ago. Reckon I've been meaning to make good on that promise ever since." Outside, thunder rolled softly across the hills, distant and harmless now. The rain sang against the windows while Eli gathered her into his arms, the world narrowing to the quiet rhythm of their hearts. For the first time in years, Clara didn't feel haunted by the past. The loneliness, the grief, the long ache of waiting, it had all led her here. To this moment. As dawn began to break, gold spilling gently across the plains, Eli brushed a kiss against her forehead. She smiled, eyes closed, resting her head against his chest. "Morning," she whispered. "Morning," he echoed, holding her tighter. "Told you I'd be here." And when the light finally filled the room, Clara realized that sometimes love doesn't arrive like thunder or flame, it comes quietly. Like the first warmth after a long winter, the promise had been kept. And this time it would last.